On April 28, 1945, at 11:47 in the morning, Private First Class James Stewart stood inside the gates of Buchenwald concentration camp, 40 miles from the German town of Weimar. He was 23 years old, from Mobile, Alabama, a soldier in the 761st Tank Battalion. Around him lay the evidence of Nazi atrocities: emaciated bodies, gas chambers, ovens still warm from their last use. Stewart had fought across France and into Germany to liberate this place. He had risked his life to end this horror. But as he stared at the liberation he had helped achieve, one thought consumed him. In 3 months, when he returned home to Alabama, he would not be allowed to vote. He would not be allowed to drink from the same water fountain as the white soldiers standing beside him. And if he wore his uniform in the wrong part of town, he might be killed for it. The journey to Buchenwald had begun 3 years earlier, in 1942, when the United States Army finally opened combat roles to African American soldiers, not because the military wanted to, but because it needed bodies. The war in Europe was consuming men faster than the draft could replace them. African American men, volunteered by the hundreds of thousands, eager to prove their worth, eager to fight for their country. The Army accepted them, but it did not trust them. African American soldiers were placed in segregated units, commanded almost exclusively by white officers, given inferior equipment, assigned the most dangerous and least prestigious missions. The military brass believed black men lacked the intelligence for complex operations and the courage for frontline combat. These beliefs were not hidden. They were official policy, codified in training manuals and repeated by generals. James Stewart enlisted in January of 1943. He reported to Camp Claiborne, Louisiana, for basic training. The camp was segregated. Black soldiers lived in separate barracks, ate in separate mess halls, used separate latrines. When Stewart and his fellow trainees were granted weekend leave, they were forbidden from entering the town of Alexandria. Local businesses had posted signs: "No dogs, no Negroes, no soldiers." Stewart found it remarkable that dogs were listed first. Training lasted 16 weeks. Stewart learned to operate a Sherman tank, the M4A3 model with a 75mm gun. The tank weighed 33 tons. It required a crew of 5: commander, gunner, loader, driver, assistant driver. Stewart was assigned as a loader. His job was to feed shells into the gun as fast as the gunner could fire them. High explosive rounds weighed 14 pounds each. Armor-piercing rounds weighed 15 pounds. In combat, a good loader could maintain a rate of fire of 6 rounds per minute. Stewart trained until he could load 8. In October of 1943, Stewart's unit, the 761st Tank Battalion, was declared combat-ready. The battalion consisted of 36 Sherman tanks, 700 men, all African American except for the senior officers. The men called themselves the Black Panthers, a name they chose themselves, a symbol of strength and defiance. The War Department did not approve. The name stayed anyway. The battalion shipped out to England in August of 1944. They arrived expecting immediate deployment to France. Instead, they waited. For 2 months, the 761st sat in England, while white units with less training and less time in service were sent to the front. The official reason was logistical constraints. The real reason was prejudice. General George S. Patton's Third Army needed tank support, but Patton did not want black soldiers. He believed they would break under fire. He requested white replacements. The War Department had no white tank battalions available. Patton was told to take the 761st or go without. On October 10, 1944, Patton addressed the battalion before their deployment. He stood on the hood of a jeep and told 700 black soldiers that he did not care what color they were, as long as they killed Germans. He said everyone had their eyes on them, waiting for them to fail. He said they had better not fail. Then he climbed down and left without waiting for questions. The 761st entered combat on November 7, 1944, near the town of Moyenvic in northeastern France. Their mission was to support the 26th Infantry Division in breaking through German defenses. The Germans had fortified the area with anti-tank guns, machine gun nests, and minefields. Intelligence said the position was heavily defended. Intelligence was correct. Stuart's tank, designated C4, moved out at dawn. The temperature was 38 degrees Fahrenheit. Rain had turned the roads to mud. Visibility was less than 200 yards due to fog. The Germans opened fire at 400 yards. Anti-tank rounds struck two of the lead Sherman tanks. Both exploded. The crews did not survive. Stuart's tank pushed forward. The commander, Lieutenant Harrison, ordered the gunner to return fire. Stuart loaded high explosive rounds as fast as the breech would cycle. The gun fired, recoiled, ejected the spent casing. Stuart grabbed another shell from the rack, loaded it, slapped the breech, closed. The gunner fired again. This continued for 17 minutes. Stuart loaded 94 rounds. His hands were burned from the hot shell casings. His ears were bleeding from the concussive force of the gun firing inside the enclosed space of the tank. But the tank kept moving, kept firing, kept advancing. By the end of the day, the 761st had pushed through the German defenses. They had destroyed 12 enemy positions, captured 40 prisoners, and opened a route for the infantry to advance. They had also lost 6 tanks and 23 men. The 26th Infantry Division commander sent a commendation to the battalion. The commendation praised their bravery and effectiveness. It did not mention their race. That was progress. Over the next 6 months, the 761st fought in 5 major campaigns across France, Belgium, and Germany. They fought at the Battle of the Bulge. They fought through the Siegfried Line. They fought in conditions that broke veteran units. And they did not break. But as James Stuart's tank rolled through the gates of Buchenwald on that April morning in 1945, liberating victims of the worst racial hatred the world had ever seen, he carried with him a question that no amount of combat could answer. What would liberation mean for him? On April 29, 1945, at 8:15 in the morning, Private First Class James Stuart walked through the barracks of Buchenwald with a canteen of water and a medic's bag. Survivors reached for him with skeletal hands. They spoke languages he did not understand, but their eyes communicated everything: gratitude, relief, hope. An elderly Polish man grabbed Stuart's hand and kissed it, tears streaming down his face. Stuart helped him to his feet. The man weighed perhaps 80 pounds. Stuart had seen death before. He had seen it on battlefields across Europe, but he had never seen systematic extermination. This was different. This was industrial-scale hatred. And as Stuart moved through the camp, helping survivors, distributing food and water, he realized something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The Nazis had treated these prisoners with the same contempt that white Americans reserved for him. The liberation of Buchenwald was not the 761st's primary mission. The battalion had been advancing through central Germany, pushing toward the Czech border, when orders came to divert south. Intelligence reported a large concentration camp near Weimar. The 6th Armored Division had reached it first on April 11th, but the camp was massive, 60 square miles, over 20,000 survivors. Additional forces were needed to secure the area, evacuate the sick, and process the evidence of Nazi war crimes. Stuart's tank arrived at Buchenwald on April 28th. The smell reached them before they saw the camp. Sweet, rot, chemicals. The smell of mass death. When the tanks rolled through the main gate, survivors emerged from the barracks. They were living skeletons, men and women who weighed 60 or 70 pounds, dressed in striped uniforms that hung from their frames like cloth on wire. Some could walk, many could not. They stared at the American soldiers with expressions that mixed disbelief and joy. Stuart climbed out of his tank, A German-speaking officer was attempting to communicate with the survivors, trying to understand what had happened here. The survivors pointed to buildings, the gas chambers, the crematoriums, the medical experimentation blocks. They pointed to piles of bodies that had not yet been burned. They pointed to the ovens. Some of the ovens were still warm. Stuart spent 3 days at Buchenwald. The army had assigned the Svenensensik first to assist with camp operations, while other units continued the advance. Stuart's job was distribution of food and medical supplies. The survivors were starving, but they could not eat normal rations. Their bodies could not process rich food after years of starvation. The medics had to ration carefully small portions of bread and soup, gradually increasing over days. Some survivors ate too much too quickly. Their bodies could not handle it. They died from the food that was meant to save them. On the second day, Stuart was working in Barracks 17 when he met a man named Samuel. Samuel was French, a Jew from Paris, arrested in 1942 and sent to Buchenwald in 1943. He spoke some English, learned from American films before the war. He told Stuart his story. His family had been taken. His wife, his 2 children. He did not know where. He had been selected for work detail because he was young and strong. That was 3 years ago. Now he weighed 92 pounds. Samuel asked Stuart where he was from. Stuart said Alabama. Samuel asked if Alabama was a good place. Stuart did not know how to answer that question. He settled on the truth. He told Samuel that in Alabama he could not vote. He could not eat in white restaurants. He could not attend white schools. He could not marry a white woman. If he was accused of a crime, he would not receive a fair trial. If he was accused of offending a white woman, he might be lynched without any trial at all. Samuel listened. Then he said something Stuart would never forget. He said the Nazis had treated Jews the way white Americans treated Negroes, only the Nazis had been more efficient about it. Samuel did not say this with malice. He said it as an observation, a comparison between 2 systems built on the same foundation, the belief that some humans were worth less than others. Stuart had no response. He gave Samuel a piece of bread and moved to the next bunk. The irony was inescapable. Stuart had crossed an ocean to fight fascism, to defeat a regime built on racial hatred, only to realize that his own country operated under similar principles. The difference was scale and method. Nazi Germany built camps and gas chambers. The American South built segregation and Jim Crow. Nazi Germany murdered 6 million Jews. The American South lynched thousands of Black Americans and terrorized millions more. The mechanisms were different, but the ideology was the same. Racial superiority, racial purity, the belief that one group of humans had the right to dominate, exploit, or exterminate another. And yet, Stuart wore the uniform. He had fought for this country. He had risked his life in 5 major campaigns. He had loaded shells into a 75mm gun, while anti-tank rounds exploded around him. He had pulled wounded men from burning tanks. He had done everything his country had asked of him. And when he returned home, he would still be a second-class citizen. On April 30th, the 706th received orders to move out. Other units would handle the ongoing operations at Buchenwald. The battalion was needed at the front. The war was not over. German forces were collapsing, but they were still fighting. Stuart climbed back into his tank. He took one last look at the camp. Survivors were being loaded onto trucks for evacuation to field hospitals. The bodies were being buried in mass graves. The ovens were being photographed and documented for war crimes tribunals. Stuart's tank rolled out through the main gate at 14:30. The battalion drove east, back toward the fighting, back to the war. But something had changed for Stuart. He had seen what racial hatred looked like when taken to its logical conclusion. He had seen the camps, the ovens, the bodies, and he knew that the same hatred existed in his own country, just dressed in different clothes, justified by different words. The question Stuart carried as his tank left Buchenwald was simple and terrible. If America could fight a war to end this evil in Europe, why couldn't it end the same evil at home? On July 26, 1946, at 19:43 in the evening, James Stuart stepped off a Greyhound bus in Mobile, Alabama. He was wearing his Army uniform, the same uniform he had worn at Buchenwald, the same uniform he had worn through 5 campaigns across Europe. On his chest were 5 medals: the Bronze Star, the Purple Heart, the European African Middle Eastern Campaign Medal with 5 Bronze Service Stars, the World War II Victory Medal, and the Army Good Conduct Medal. He carried a duffel bag with everything he owned. He had been discharged from the Army 3 days earlier at Fort Dix, New Jersey, with an honorable discharge and a handshake from a captain who thanked him for his service. Now he was home, and within 20 minutes of stepping off that bus, he would understand exactly what his service had earned him in the eyes of his country. Stuart walked through the bus terminal toward the exit. He was hungry. There was a diner attached to the terminal, a small restaurant with a lunch counter and booths. Stuart entered and sat at the counter. A waitress approached. She was white, perhaps 40 years old, blonde hair tied back. She looked at Stuart, at his uniform, at his medals. Then she pointed to a sign on the wall. "We reserve the right to refuse service to anyone." She told him he needed to leave. Stuart asked why. She said coloreds were not allowed at the counter. There was a separate window at the back for takeout orders. Stuart could order there if he wanted. Stuart sat for 10 seconds, looking at the waitress, at the sign, at the other customers who had stopped eating to watch. Then he stood up and walked out. He did not go to the takeout window. He was not hungry anymore. The bus terminal incident was the first. It would not be the last. Over the next 3 months, Stuart experienced the full reality of being a black veteran in the American South. He applied for jobs at factories, warehouses, construction sites. Most would not hire him. The ones that would offered him wages, half of what white workers earned for the same work. He applied for a loan to buy a house through the GI Bill. The bank rejected his application. The loan officer explained that the neighborhoods where Stuart wanted to buy were restricted. Blacks could not purchase property there. When Stuart asked about neighborhoods where blacks could buy, the officer said those neighborhoods did not qualify for GI Bill loans. The properties were considered too high risk. Stuart tried to register to vote. Alabama required literacy tests for voter registration. The test was administered by a white registrar who asked Stuart to interpret Section 22 of the Alabama Constitution. The section was 174 words long, written in legal language. Stuart read it and provided his interpretation. The registrar said his answer was incorrect. Stuart asked what the correct answer was. The registrar said that was not his job to explain. Stuart was denied registration. On October 14, 1946, Stuart was walking home from a construction site where he had worked a 10-hour shift loading materials. He was still in work clothes, not his uniform. 3 white men in a pickup truck pulled alongside him. They asked where he was going. Stuart said home. They asked if he was one of those uppity veterans who thought fighting in Europe made him equal to white folks. Stuart said he just wanted to go home. One of the men got out of the truck. He was holding a tire iron. He told Stuart to get in the truck. Stuart ran. He made it 4 blocks before the truck caught up. The men beat him in the middle of the street. Tire iron, fists, boots. They broke his nose, fractured his jaw, cracked 3 ribs. They told him to remember his place. Then they drove away. Stuart crawled to a nearby house and knocked on the door. A black family took him in, cleaned his wounds, let him rest. They did not call the police. Calling the police would have made things worse. Stuart was not unique. Across the South, black veterans were being attacked, humiliated, denied the benefits they had earned. In February of 1946, a black veteran named Isaac Woodard was pulled off a bus in South Carolina by police, beaten, and blinded. His crime was asking to use the restroom. In July of 1946, two black veteran couples were murdered by a white mob in Monroe, Georgia. Their crime was trying to register to vote. In August of 1946, a black veteran named John Jones was lynched in Louisiana for wearing his uniform in public. The sheriff ruled it a suicide. The GI Bill, signed into law in 1944, was supposed to provide veterans with access to education, home loans, and business financing. For white veterans it worked. It created the American middle class, funded college educations, built suburban neighborhoods. For black veterans it was a broken promise. Southern universities refused to admit them. Banks refused to loan them money. Businesses refused to hire them at equal wages. The federal government had created a program that was supposed to reward military service. But the program was administered by state and local officials who used it to reinforce segregation. Stewart tried to use his GI Bill benefits to attend college. He applied to the University of Alabama. The application was rejected. The university did not admit Negroes. Stewart applied to Alabama State College, a black institution in Montgomery. He was admitted, but the GI Bill housing stipend was not enough to cover his expenses. He worked 2 jobs while attending classes. He lasted 1 semester before exhaustion forced him to withdraw. By the end of 1946, Stewart had abandoned most of his plans. No college degree, no house, no vote, no equality. He took a job at a steel mill in Birmingham, loading furnaces for $52 an hour. White workers doing the same job earned $0.89 an hour. Stewart did not complain. Complaining could get you fired, or worse. The steel mill was hot, dangerous work. Men lost fingers in the machinery, some lost hands, some died when molten metal splashed from the furnaces. The company did not provide safety equipment. Workers bought their own gloves, their own boots. Stewart worked there for 11 months. He saved what money he could. On the evening of December 7, 1947, Stewart sat in his rented room in Birmingham, the same room he had lived in since returning from Europe, and opened a letter from the War Department. It was an invitation to a ceremony honoring the 761st Tank Battalion. The ceremony would be held in Washington, D.C. The president would be in attendance. Stewart stared at the letter for a long time. Then he folded it, placed it in a drawer, and decided he would not go. What was there to honor? On November 10, 1997, at 14:30 in the afternoon, James Stewart stood in the East Room of the White House, 76 years old, leaning on a cane, surrounded by 7 other surviving members of the 761st Tank Battalion. President Bill Clinton stood at a podium, holding a piece of paper that would finally, after 52 years, acknowledge what Stewart and his brothers-in-arms had done in World War II. The Presidential Medal of Freedom, the nation's highest civilian honor, was being awarded posthumously to the entire battalion. Stewart had lived long enough to see this moment. 682 of his comrades had not. They had died in the decades after the war, died without recognition, died without the equality they had fought for, died waiting for America to remember. And as President Clinton began to speak, Stewart felt something he had not felt in half a century, not pride, not satisfaction, but something close to closure. The journey from that rented room in Birmingham in 1947 to the White House in 1997 had taken 50 years. For Stewart, those years had been long, hard, marked by small victories and persistent injustice. He had left the steel mill in Birmingham in 1948, moved to Detroit, where factories were hiring black workers at closer to equal wages. He had worked at a Ford plant for 23 years, assembling transmissions on the line. He had married in 1952, raised 3 children, bought a house in a black neighborhood on the East Side. The GI Bill had never helped him, but the United Auto Workers Union had. The union fought for equal pay, equal treatment. It was not perfect, but it was better than Alabama. Stewart had watched the civil rights movement from a distance. He had seen the Montgomery bus boycott in 1955, the Little Rock Nine in 1957, the Freedom Rides in 1961. He had watched the March on Washington in 1963 on television in his living room, heard Martin Luther King Jr. speak about a dream. Stewart wanted to believe in that dream, but his experience had taught him caution. Change was possible, but it was slow, painful, paid for in blood. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 changed the legal landscape. Segregation was outlawed, discrimination was illegal. Black Americans could finally vote without literacy tests or poll taxes, but laws on paper did not immediately change hearts or systems. Stewart registered to vote in Detroit in 1965. He was 44 years old. It was the first time he had successfully registered. He voted in every election after that, local, state, federal. He had earned that right in the mud of France and the ruins of Germany. Now he could finally exercise it. Throughout those decades, Stewart rarely spoke about the war. His children knew he had served, knew he had been in Europe, but they did not know the details. They did not know about Buchenwald. They did not know about the 761st's combat record. Stewart kept those memories private, locked away. The war had been complicated for him, a mixture of pride in what he had accomplished and anger at what had been denied him. He did not know how to explain that to his children. In 1978, a historian named Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, who would later become famous as a basketball player and activist, began researching the 761st Tank Battalion for a documentary project. He tracked down surviving members, including Stewart. Abdul-Jabbar asked Stewart to share his story. Stewart initially refused, but Abdul-Jabbar was persistent. He explained that the 761st's story was being forgotten, that most Americans did not know black soldiers had fought in tank battalions, did not know about their combat record, did not know they had helped liberate concentration camps. If the survivors did not speak, the history would be lost. Stewart agreed to an interview. It lasted 4 hours. He talked about training at Camp Claiborne, about Patton's speech, about combat in France and Germany, about Buchenwald, about coming home to Alabama, about the betrayal he had felt. The interview was recorded, transcribed, included in Abdul-Jabbar's research. But the documentary was never completed. Funding fell through. The project was shelved. Stewart's story went back into silence. In 1992, the Army conducted a review of World War II units that had been recommended for, but never received, the Medal of Honor. The review discovered that no African-American soldier had received the Medal of Honor during World War II, despite the fact that over 1 million black soldiers had served. This was statistically impossible unless discrimination had influenced the awards process. The review identified several cases where black soldiers had been recommended for the Medal of Honor, but downgraded to lesser awards. The recommendations were racist in their justifications, claiming black soldiers lacked the intelligence or courage for the nation's highest military honor. The review led to a broader examination of how black units had been treated during and after the war. The 761st Tank Battalion was part of that examination. Researchers documented the battalion's combat record: 183 days in continuous combat, 5 major campaigns, breakthrough operations at the Battle of the Bulge, first American unit to link up with Soviet forces, 36 tanks lost, 71 men killed, 463 wounded. General Patton, who had initially opposed accepting black soldiers, had later written a commendation stating the 761st had performed with courage and efficiency equal to any unit in his command. Despite this record, the 761st had received minimal recognition. Individual soldiers had received Bronze Stars and Purple Hearts, but the unit itself had never been honored. This was corrected in 1978 when the battalion received a Presidential Unit Citation, but by then, most of the original members were dead. The 1997 ceremony at the White House was different. This was not a military award. This was the nation acknowledging a moral debt. President Clinton spoke about the courage of black soldiers who fought for a country that did not treat them as equals. He spoke about the contradiction they had lived. Liberating Europe from fascism while facing oppression at home. He spoke about the long delay in recognition, the decades of silence, the injustice of forgotten heroism. Stewart accepted the medal on behalf of his fallen comrades. He shook the president's hand. Cameras flashed. Reporters asked questions. Stewart gave short answers. He was not comfortable with attention. He had spent 50 years avoiding it. After the ceremony, a young reporter asked Stewart if the medal made up for what had been done to him and his fellow soldiers. Stewart thought about the question. He thought about the bus terminal in Mobile, the beating in the street, the denied GI Bill benefits, the decades of waiting. Then he answered. He said the medal did not make up for anything. Recognition could not undo injustice. But it mattered that the country was finally willing to acknowledge what had happened. It mattered that younger generations would know the story. It mattered that the 761st would not be forgotten. James Stewart died on March 17, 2005, at the age of 83. He was buried at Arlington National Cemetery with full military honors. His Bronze Star, his Purple Heart, his Presidential Medal of Freedom were displayed at his funeral. His children spoke about his service, his sacrifice, his quiet dignity. They spoke about a man who had fought for his country, even when his country did not fight for him. The contradiction Stewart lived, the paradox of fighting for freedom while being denied it, was not unique to him. It was the experience of over 1 million African-American soldiers in World War II. They fought in segregated units, commanded by white officers who often doubted their abilities. They faced discrimination in training, in combat, in the benefits they received after the war. And yet they fought. They fought at Normandy, at the Battle of the Bulge, in the Pacific Islands, in North Africa, in Italy. They fought because they believed, despite everything, that their service might change their country, that their courage might earn them the equality they deserved. It took decades. The change did not come from gratitude or recognition. It came from legal battles, protests, activism, the slow, grinding work of the civil rights movement. But it came. And men like James Stewart lived long enough to see some of it. The 761st Tank Battalion's motto was, "Come out fighting." They had chosen it themselves, a declaration of their refusal to accept the limitations placed on them. They had come out fighting in Europe, and when they returned home, they continued to fight, not with tanks and guns, but with persistence, dignity, and the quiet refusal to accept injustice as permanent. If this story affected you, if it made you think about the price paid by those who served, hit that like button. Share this with someone who needs to understand what these men faced. Subscribe, because these stories deserve to be told, and too many have been buried in silence. Drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from. Tell us if someone in your family served and faced similar injustice. Tell us you were here. James Stewart and the men of the 761st Tank Battalion fought for a country that turned its back on them. But they never stopped believing it could be better. That belief cost them everything. The least we can do is remember. Thank you for watching. Thank you for making sure their sacrifice is not forgotten.